Access is not just about getting in, it's about what you can do when you're inside. Many security incidents happen today not because somebody gained access, but because they were able to perform things and activities that they should never have been able to perform in the first place. Welcome to today's deep dive on CMMC Access Control Level 1 3.1.2 Transaction and Function Control. I'm Dr. Dami. Let's get right into it. This practice area has two assessment objectives, and the focus is limiting system access. Let's start with some basic definition and understanding of what functions and transactions are. Functions on their own refers to the type of action or capabilities a user is allowed to perform within a system. While on the other hand, transaction refers to a specific instance of carrying out a function. You see, they are interdependent, usually involving data or a system operation. Now, in a nutshell, the control requires organizations to restrict system access to specific types of transactions and functions. Now, this is about fine-grained, authorization. It's not can you access the system. It is more of what exactly are you allowed to do inside the system. Why does this control matter? In real world, attackers don't start with admin access, as we all know. They don't need full control immediately. Instead, they gain basic access, they explore available functions, abuse legitimate capabilities. This is how most breaches usually unfold. Now, let's take a simple example. A user has access to export function. Export function. That function is not restricted in any way, meaning the user can export anything. Now, sensitive data is exported and exfiltrated. No firewall failure, no intrusion detection failure alert anywhere. Just more of what we call poor transaction control. At this point, security doesn't fail at access. Oh, you have access. It fails at what access is allowed to do. So if a user can get into your environment but cannot do anything, your security is still intact. That's the meaning. So it doesn't fail at access, gaining access, but it fails at what that access can achieve within the environment. Now, let's look at this distinction because it's extremely important for CMMC assessments as we go along. Transaction functions. How are they different? What are they? So let me start with function. Function is system level. They are tied to system capabilities. Examples would be, oh, you can run a script, you can access admin console, you can modify configurations, you can create users, you can approve a request, you can modify system settings, you can view report. These are system level activities under function. You call them functions. Now, for transaction will be the business level. These are tied to business processes like approving invoices. You want to modify payroll, you want to delete a customer's data, you want to submit change, you want to create a specific user. So if we link the two together, for the function, you will have a function that can say create a user. That is a function. Now we're going to tie this function to a particular user. Say create a specific account or a user account, e.g. maybe you want to add John Doe. So that function is given to a specific user. You can say user A, whereas user B doesn't have that same function. You see the logic? Now, a user might be able to, be allowed one from the various functions that you have, while the other is not given. That means one user can have create a user, while the other user does not have that. Another user can have modify system setting, while another user doesn't have that function. It goes vice versa. Now, let me give you an example. You have a finance user that approves invoices. That is under transaction. Approving invoice. The approve invoice is a function, but that function is given to a user. So that finance user is doing a transaction. But that same user is not allowed to modify backend database. That's a function. So at the end of the day, if you don't separate this clearly, you lose control. This objective is about definition and clarity. You must explicitly define what actions are allowed per role, what actions are restricted, what functions are accessible. This typically exists in like role-based access control matrix. You see the structure of the matrix. Access control policy, application role definition. If you see what I have on the screen, you see the roles, admin, HR, employee, and then you see what they can do, view data, edit data, approve, and all that. So you see one role has approval for all the four, while the other has only one. Now, for an assessor, if I ask what can this user do, and you cannot clearly answer that, it's most likely that that control is not going to be met. That means you're going to fill the practice area. Now, organization must be able to define rules and enforce them. This objective requires system must technically restrict actions. An example of that is like a database. User can select but not delete. For an application, a user can view but not export. For something like API, the token can be read but not modified. So key point here is that if enforcement is not happening at the system level, the control fails regardless of the kind of policy you have in your organization. What is the risk if this control is not enforced? Let's look at a real pattern we see during assessment. I mean, I've been involved in some assessments for my organization, and I see some of this pattern regularly. So a user is assigned defined role. We see HR role, like you see on the screen. You see the admin role, you see employee role, and you see what they can do. Defined permission is also there. So you see the view, you see the edit, you see approved, you see delete, and all that. Now, this answers what is each user allowed to do. However, enforcement will be what must be proven separately. You have to prove that separately. This is authorization. You are authorized to view this. You're authorized to edit this. You're authorized to approve this. But enforcement must be separately proven. A system prevents unauthorized actions. Controls are technically implemented. So this will answer what happens if they try to do what they are not allowed to do. Now, a system breach or a breach scenario will be an insider deleting audit logs, or covers tracks or commits fraud. So the role-based access control table that you see on the screen, that satisfies the 3.1.2a, which is the definition. But this scenario of a breach that I just gave explains failure of implementation or enforcement. And this, is extremely common in the financial system or healthcare system, SaaS platform. The issue is actually not the access. The issue is unrestricted function execution. So if enforcement is missing, you risk loss of integrity and accountability. So what are some common pitfalls? Now, these are real failures that we see in the industry. We have, overprivileged roles. Everyone has admin, convenience over security. You have role definition without enforcement, which looks good on paper, not implemented. You have default permission system deployed with broad access. You also have no monitoring, actions are not logged, abuse go goes undetected. And the biggest issue is that we trust our users. Well, we are talking about controls here, and trust is certainly not a control. So an assessor's perspective will be that they will ask for role definitions, select a user, validate what those users can do, test system behavior. They will review logs. If I can perform an unauthorized function or bypass a restriction, the control is not satisfied. This is a testable control, so it's not just going to be theoretical or based on policy. An assessor can decide to test this. Going further on the assessor's perspective, we see that over here there is, under the examine, interview, test, and as I mentioned earlier, these are the discretion of the lead assessor. They decide who and what they want to test, who they want to interview, and then from the evidence collection, they decide what evidence is sufficient and adequate. So you must provide enough evidence for them to satisfy those two conditions. It must be adequate and sufficient. Final takeaway: authentication controls access to systems. Authorization control access to impact. If a user can delete data, export data, modify transaction without restrictions, then your risk is no longer potential. It is already realized. Remember, most breaches don't happen because access was granted. They happen because access were not controlled. We must find a way to merge the two. As you authorize, you must also enforce within your environment and have documentation, evidences to show that that control was fully met. All right, welcome back. So this is the demo for the RBAC implementation, the role-based access control. If you remember, 3.1.2 access control level 1 says transaction and function control. And the focus is to limit system access to the type of transactions and functions that authorized users are permitted to execute. So right now, from our domain controller, this is the list of all the CUI users. I have the admin users, I have authorized devices, I have CUI users only, and these are the list of the users. Let's go over to see the shared folder for the data. This is the data folder for CUI, and what we want to do is we want to see the two layers of implementation from Active Directory group, the authorization layer, and we also want to see the folder permission, which is the enforcement layer. So for the authorization layer, we have I have all these users there. You have the CUI admin, CUI authorized, devices, service account, all those details are there. So roles are clearly defined here. CUI scoping is intentional and structured, and this satisfies the 3.1.2, which is define users, plus their role. So for folder permission, where we have the enforcement layer, I'm going to right click on the CUI data folder, go to properties, and then go to security. And we can see clearly here that the CUI users have their permissions defined. You have the read and execute, list and list the folder, and then read. Whereas for the administrator, you have the full permission defined. So what we see here is that group, not the users, are assigned to permissions. And then we also have functions are clearly restricted. And then, of course, enforcement is also happening at the system level here. Now, for control mapping, what we have is that 3.1.2 is defined. Active Directory group defines who can access the CUI. Define who can access the CUI, which is just this users here, and then you also have what categories they belong to. So for 3.1.2 function and transaction control, so the functions restricted, read, execute, no modification allowed, and then for the transaction, you have the users cannot modify stuff, they cannot delete file, they can only read, and so on and so forth. So for enforcement, NTFS permission actively prevents unauthorized actions, not just documented but also implemented here. And then as an assessor, what an assessor will say when they see or they have this kind of evidence is that access to CUI is controlled through role-based group in Active Directory, and these rules are enforced at the file system level using the NTFS permission that restricts function such as read, modify, and of course delete. So that's the demo for transaction and function control. See you in the next practice area.